We had the luck to have been collaborating with Kelly Leandro. She's a Principal Employee Relations Consultant in CU Boulder Central HR, and she has been teaming up with us since 2019 for different trainings, and this is a great one, and I cannot emphasize that enough. If you have supervisors under you, please make sure you remind them to go to the Supervisor Resources page of Inside CIRES and watch the recording, which will be uploaded within the next 3 days. If you have any questions or if they have any questions, please send them my way. So Kelly, take it away and let us know about your preferred method for questions, please. Lucia and I will be monitoring the chat.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jimena. Well, hi, everyone. As Jimena said, my name is Kelly Leandro, and I work in the Employee Relations Unit, and I have been there for about 10 years, which is crazy, but it has. It'll be 10 years this fall. So as Jimena said, today will be talking about the CIRES ASA process and how that aligns with performance management best practices across campus and some of those standard practices that apply to all of campus. My sort of training style is really informal, so please feel free to kind of either raise your hand or feel free to put a message in the chat. I'll be kind of monitoring the chat, but Jimena and Lucia, if you all see anyone with a raised hand, since I can't see the whole list, please just let me know and we can just kind of address it as we're going through the slides. Okay. So really to begin, what is performance management? And really kind of have two separate definitions, or people talk about it in kind of different ways, depending on the way in which they're meaning it. So sometimes when you hear performance management across campus, that can really mean the logistical process. So what are the timelines? What are the required tasks or action items that a supervisor and an employee will need to complete? So for our process, that is the objectives and planning section, the check-ins, and then that final ASA evaluation narrative and summary, and then the required paperwork and sign-offs. Also, though, when we talk about performance management, sometimes we're talking about philosophy, and really performance management philosophy really is synonymous with what is good supervision? What does that look like? What are the behaviors and competencies that we would expect from supervisors and employees as they go through this process, and really build a relationship and how to maintain that. So part of the philosophy of performance management are supervision fundamentals, how to build rapport with your direct reports, how to give continuous, candid feedback, providing those areas of positive feedback as well as areas of growth opportunity. How to engage in that two-way dialogue and have those crucial conversations when needed, and then how to mentor and create succession planning within your unit. So all of that is sort of wrapped up into performance management, depending again on kind of which definition you're talking about. So the next question would be, well, why is performance management important? And certainly if we're talking about the timeline and compliance pieces, that is to ensure consistency across campus and kind of an equitable process in terms of evaluation and the merit process. If we're talking about why it's important on the philosophical side, performance management or good supervision can help organizations achieve excellence by aligning their work and resources to those clearly defined goals and imperatives, helping employees and supervisors set clear expectations of one another. And that's really important. I think sometimes it's seen as just kind of a one-way pathway for setting expectations, but really employees need to understand what they can and should be expecting from their supervisor as well. Providing those opportunities for ongoing direct and constructive feedback, again, building those relationships which ultimately helps build partnership and collaboration, which adds to the success of the organization. And then certainly reinforcing those values that the organization has set, either through policy or kind of system-wide competencies that are reflective of their values. So our objectives and agenda for today are really to identify the general principles of effective performance management, and then understand how the performance management cycle for research staff, including performance timeline, the evaluation process, how to address performance concerns through the informal and formal disciplinary processes, how to have difficult conversations, providing that timely feedback, and how to document when those conversations are had. We certainly are also going to talk about the interplay of family medical leave with performance and how to partner with the FMLA Service Center and CIRES HR. We'll also talk about the planning process for ongoing feedback, regular check-ins, and ASA. Okay, so really to start, we wanted to kind of define the differentiation between central HR, employee relations role versus HR within CIRES. So our office is a neutral advisory office, and we do have an obligation to report to OIC, meaning that if an employee or supervisor comes to talk to us, we are not confidential in the way that FSAP and OVA are, in that if any member mentions any possible discrimination or harassment, we do have to report that down to OIC. We also certainly can connect employees and supervisors to all campus resources. So that would include OIC, which is the Office of Institutional Equity and Compliance. That's our Title IX office. So again, that's where all of the discrimination and harassment claims would go when they're based on protected class. The ADA office is our Americans with Disabilities office. And so that would be a resource that would provide potential accommodations to anyone, to any staff or faculty across campus that may be looking to take advantage of their services. We have our FMLA family office, which is now located at the central system team. And we can share a bit more about that resource that recently transitioned this past fall from being a campus resource to being a system-wide resource because of the implementation of family, which I'll get into a little bit later. But we still have a leave resource available for campus. OVA is our Office of Victims Assistance. So they are advocates across campus. FSAP is our Faculty and Staff Assistance Program. That is confidential counseling. It's the university's kind of version of an EAP program. CAPS is the equivalent, except that is for students. We also have our BIT team, which is our behavioral intervention team or a threat assessment team, which I will get into in later slides as well. And then our ombuds office, which is really for conflict mediation purposes. I do have a resource for supervisors and employees that I'll also be giving after this presentation that kind of lists out the differences between all of these different campus resources. Our office, though, in employee relations, we also serve as a resource for supervisors and employees, and we really focus on campus policy and compliance, performance, discipline, and then procedures and best practices. So those are kind of the main reasons that people would come to our offices. We are not an investigatory fact-finding office, so that's an important distinction. We will help supervisors and employees navigate through potential investigations, but those would still be at the discretion and authority of the departments to complete. And then certainly we partner with CIRES HR and the CIRES director and legal counsel on all disciplinary matters, as well as investigatory matters. Okay, nope. Okay, so the difference for CIRES Human Resources, their office really encourages ongoing and open communication between CIRES HR and supervisors. So they're more of that kind of frontline resource that supervisors and employees should be coming to with an initial issue. And then if it's needed to escalate to employee relations, we can do so. They provide training and resources to all CIRES constituents. Partner with CIRES units to promote and exercise performance management practices effectively. CIRES HR will ensure compliance with defined university requirements and partner with federal units when appropriate. And then assist the CIRES director with progressive discipline when appropriate. So just some thought points for employees and supervisors on performance evaluation guidance. So just keeping in mind, and this is, this has been since the inception of the pandemic, but I think it still applies. So just keeping in mind that all of the changes and the agility that campus has needed to go through for the last several years keeping in mind that staff have demonstrated that extraordinary commitment to the well-being and continued success of the campuses, while really continuing to advance and adapt their work, leadership, and service just kind of through the changing landscape. So keeping those points in mind during performance evaluations. Focusing on how individuals kind of stepped up and helped out, the ability to pivot and be agile during changing work demands. How did the employee contribute to the chancellor's and the campus's values? How did they demonstrate leadership, delegation, and decision-making? And how did they demonstrate the department or university core competencies? So these are always important thought points to keep in mind as supervisors are starting to contemplate the year-end evaluation. Also, keeping in mind that reviews are about feedback, learning, growth, and celebrating achievements. Of course, we have to pay credit where credit is due in terms of, positive assessments as well as areas for growth, and both should be reflected. But keeping in mind that the overall assessment really does need to be about providing that level of feedback. Taking that holistic look at the employee's performance. So that should really encompass the entire performance year, not just the past few months, which is an unconscious bias that we sometimes have, but really kind of going back through emails and any notes you would have kept to think about the entire year's performance. And then keeping evaluations simple and not including any unnecessary change. I would certainly also advocate changing an employee's sort of plan or expectations at this point in the cycle is not a best practice, because we are just a few months out now from the final evaluation. And so we really want to ensure that we have set employees up for success and that the expectations that we put in the plan were achievable for them. And so if they're only given a few months, or if a goal has changed, we just want to make sure that it is still relevant and achievable. And also that these final evaluation conversations are meant to better prepare the employee to develop as a professional and be able to address the challenges ahead. They are for development and promoting a growth mindset. Also adapting to the notion that feedback is an opportunity for growth and not meant to be punitive. So even if you do have to give feedback that might be difficult for an employee to hear, really helping kind of change that mindset that it is meant for growth and opportunity, kind of as a corrective measure. So there are three main steps in performance management. That always begins with performance planning. So kind of listing out the goals and objectives for the year. Then the coaching and review is a process that happens kind of at the midpoint of the cycle year. So really that should be the January, February mark. Again, that would be kind of going through the performance plan, making any adjustments as necessary, making any updates, and having that discussion between the supervisor and the employee of kind of how is it going so far, and if any changes do need to be made. And then certainly the performance evaluation, or the ASA, that occurs at the end of the year. Going back through the plan, kind of giving that evaluative narrative summary of how an employee did and giving that performance rating. So I'd say the biggest part of the performance management cycle really is that coaching piece. And while there is that one step in the middle where we do have to do that mid-year check-in, kind of that formal meeting, feedback should be given throughout the cycle year. And so that's really what this slide is focusing on, is how to have those ongoing successful conversations where supervisors are providing feedback throughout the year. So the purpose really is to provide that dedicated time to communicate face-to-face between supervisors and direct reports, providing that safe space for coaching, mentoring, ongoing feedback, and those check-in meetings, to ensure that the supervisor and their team are aligned and focused on the mission-critical tasks and projects. And then ensuring that there are those regular ongoing check-ins or one-on-ones to allow the manager. Apologize. I'm just going to close my door really quickly and I'll be right back a minute. I apologize for the interruption. So to ensure that the supervisor and the team are aligned and focused on those mission critical tasks and projects, and again, having those regular check-ins to allow the manager to identify issues more quickly and solving them before they become larger issues, and allowing the employee that standard communication channel to ask questions, potentially vent, and propose ideas. I'd say this is one of the biggest pieces that we see in employee relations where there can be conflict in this process is if these ongoing check-ins don't occur, or if issues are not talked about in the moment and they're left to linger. If they're then brought to employee relations to say, well, this issue happened months ago, and we ask, well, what happened in that follow-up conversation? And the answer is we never had it, or I haven't, had the chance to tell them that it's an issue. That's one of the biggest hurdles that we see because, an employee will need to know something's an issue before we can move forward down the progressive discipline process. So you have to have that difficult conversation of providing that feedback in the moment or closely thereafter. Certainly when supervisors have these one-on-one check-in meetings, whether there's constructive feedback to give or not, both the employee and supervisor really should come prepared with agenda items for this meeting. It really is meant to be a two-way dialogue, and through that process, by having agenda items prepared, it will help with that collaboration and partnership. One way that supervisors can potentially kind of get more collaboration or communication during that meeting if it is a bit stalled. Phrases like tell me more or help me understand, or asking the employee to suggest solutions, not just problems and concerns, can be another way to try and elicit that collaboration. Okay, so some critical steps in providing feedback. We certainly want to respect an employee's privacy, which would mean if we do need to have really any type of feedback conversation, but especially if there's going to be constructive feedback, making sure that we are respecting everyone's privacy. So holding that in a private space, whether it's over Zoom or in a closed office meeting, these conversations should not be happening, in the sort of lounge area or in the hallway. We need to be giving kind of that due respect and credit for that conversation. Building a bridge is essential. So having that kind of foundational relationship between an employee and a supervisor is critical to then being able to provide feedback. If there isn't any type of basis for a relationship or trust, it makes providing feedback much harder. And again, that goes along with establishing and maintaining that rapport, which again, having weekly one-on-one meetings will naturally help build because it is just more face time. It's more ability to communicate and kind of get to know one another. Being a strong leader, this is also a really important component. I think, providing feedback, especially constructive feedback, is difficult. And it doesn't come naturally to most people. And it's a skill that supervisors have to practice and kind of train on, but it's part of being a leader. It's part of being a supervisor. We as supervisors would not be doing our job correctly or really being a good supervisor or mentor to employees if we didn't sort of have that professional courage to have those difficult conversations when we need to. And so that goes along with, one of the essential elements in providing feedback is that we as leaders have to be strong and have to engage in that difficult conversation. Providing clear and consistent messages, and I would say iterative as well. So whether it's about expectations or performance feedback, we need to ensure that we are saying it often and that it's consistent and not kind of changing every one-on-one. One way to do this as well would be to send follow-up emails or have some type of platform or management system where you just keep notes for every one-on-one. It could even be sort of a shared platform that supervisors and employees could both access, just to make sure that the communication is clear and accessible to both in terms of what the expectations were or what the agenda items that were talked about, any action items that came from that. To make sure that both employee and supervisor have a clear understanding of what was discussed. Certainly being real about the expectations of the job. We see that sometimes as well, especially with supervisors who want to be able to provide those resources to employees, even if they're kind of outside of their job role. Sometimes we do just have to kind of narrow it back into say, this is the job description, these are the projects, everything that's assigned to this role, and this is what I need you to focus on. If there is extra bandwidth or time, maybe we can look at this extra committee or sort of outside training, but we do need to sort of be real about what the position is and what it isn't. And then certainly also not shying away from the issue. That is also kind of goes into that meaning of being a strong leader, is if there is an issue, having that sort of professional voice and courage to be able to discuss it in the moment. Okay. So also part of the check-in or kind of the coaching and review step, and this is the more kind of formal step. So this would be what's occurring in January or February. The supervisor would want to make sure that they are going through the employee's ASA objectives and planning step by step, ensuring that it still kind of meets those SMART goals, that they're still relevant and specific and attainable for the employee. If they're not, this is the perfect time to make those edits and changes, and we would encourage supervisors and employees to do that. You certainly don't want to get to the end of the cycle year and have a list of expectations that are kind of all outdated or moot at that point. You just want to make sure that you're having that conversation with the employee and both are clear kind of what the new expectations are. Certainly, as part of this conversation, discussing where expectations are being met or exceeded and where improvement is needed. This is a big one, providing specific examples to help the employee understand your feedback. So what are specific instances or behaviors, especially if it's constructive feedback? Giving context to that feedback can be really helpful for employees to understand areas where they may be needing to pivot, or maybe areas where they're doing well that you want to see more of. If you can come prepared with those examples, it's helpful. And then certainly always encouraging an employee to share their self-assessments and opinions as well. And you'll see this step also in kind of that final summary at the end of the year as well. But that can really be a good sort of gap analysis for a supervisor to understand where their employee is at in terms of their own assessment of their work. If there's a discrepancy between where the supervisor thinks the employee is doing versus how the employee thinks they're doing themselves, that's an area to focus on, because clearly something is being lost in translation or in the feedback if employee and supervisor are on very different pages in terms of their level of performance. So really identifying that if it exists. Okay, so during a check-in, these are some things to really ensure that we're not doing as supervisors. Making blank statements about the employee's performance without giving examples. So that would look like you just tend to have a really negative attitude. That can come across very differently to different employees. That's a pretty blanket statement about behavior, but it's not giving specific behaviors and it's not giving specific examples. So it would be better to say something like, when you come into the office in the morning and you don't make eye contact and don't greet anyone and close your door, this is the impact that it's having. That is much more helpful feedback for an employee. So again, those specific behaviors, specific instances, and then the impact that it's having. That's also a really important step in that. Certainly, we don't want to focus purely on how the employee is not meeting expectations. We also need to incorporate positive feedback as well. And then, of course, discussing personality traits of the employee in regards to performance. Again, we want to focus on these specific behaviors. Okay, so when we do kind of get to that third kind of final step of the ASA process, when we are evaluating performance, here are just some kind of good tips for that. Requesting that the employee does complete a self-evaluation narrative. Again, for the reasons we kind of just discussed, it's really helpful to see where an employee may think that they're doing. It will help prepare the supervisor for that evaluation conversation, especially if there is a discrepancy. It can also be really helpful for a supervisor if, in sort of their review of the past year and thinking about how they want to write the narrative, there may be something that they missed or forgot about that the employee actually mentions in their self-evaluation that is helpful for the supervisor to be aware of and to consider and include in their evaluation as well. So for a lot of reasons, the self-evaluation is an important step. It's not required, but certainly employer relations advises that supervisors do engage in that process. We would say, though, if supervisors are going to do self-evaluations or have their employees do self-evaluations, it should be consistent. So it shouldn't just sort of be piecemeal of your direct reports. It should sort of be all or none. It should be a consistent practice. Certainly reviewing the employee's performance for the entire performance cycle, not just the last few months. That's considered recency bias, and we'll kind of go over some unconscious biases just to be aware of in just a moment. Certainly reviewing any notes that you've kept throughout the year regarding the employee's performance. Supervisors can do this in different ways. They can keep notebooks, they can keep kind of files and Outlook with just, emails throughout the year of when an employee has potentially gotten positive feedback from other constituents across campus, or if they are notes to the supervisor or the, notes they've taken themselves regarding times that they did have to provide that constructive feedback. That should all just kind of go in one place. So when the supervisor goes to write that final year-end narrative, they kind of have one area where they've kept all of the sort of important events and areas of feedback throughout the year. Supervisors also have the option and ability to speak with departments or individuals that the employee works closely with to capture that feedback on the employee's performance. So that would sort of be like peer feedback. They can also use a 360 feedback evaluation tool. We do have an option for that in Central HR if that's something that a supervisor is interested in. But really the point of this would be to kind of capture again, kind of that gap analysis between what a supervisor may perceive in terms of performance versus how, peers and different levels of an organization may view an employee's performance. A couple key pieces to keep in mind if you are going to use a peer or 360 feedback. Both the employee and supervisors certainly should be aware that the supervisor is going to do this. And we really recommend letting the supervisor and the employee kind of select participants. Really to kind of get the employee to engage in this process and to see the feedback as helpful and valid. As much as a supervisor can bring the employee into the process, that's helpful. It builds that collaboration and trust. So a 360 evaluation tool is, it's kind of like a peer feedback survey, except it will go, the idea is 360 around the employee. So it will go to their leadership, to their peers, and if they have any direct reports. So it's this idea of kind of a circle of all the different levels around the employee to kind of gather feedback of how those different levels in the organization view working with your employee. Sometimes we see that, supervisors or uplines can have a really positive view of an employee's performance, where then, peers or especially direct reports may have a very different perspective of how that employee kind of shows up. And that's important to know. We want to know if supervisors present or if employees present very differently to their upline versus their direct reports. That's information that you as a supervisor would need to know to be able to address potential performance concerns. So again, we'd want to share the questions with the employee that we're going to be asked. And then the supervisor really should be consistent within their direct report team. So if they're going to do it for one employee, they probably should do it for all of them, unless there's a specific reason and you can work directly with employer relations where you might need kind of a higher level evaluation just on one employee. Sometimes we'll see higher level leadership request 360 evaluations just, for one leader in the organization. But that would be different than kind of a mid-level team where a supervisor is just having peer evaluations for their entire team. But again, it's this idea of trying to get a very comprehensive understanding of an employee's performance, not just between, the employee and the supervisor or their direct reports, but really trying to get a clear picture of how this employee engages and how they present to all levels within the organization. And then certainly you would want to use any metrics that you've gathered throughout the year to help gauge performance. And what I mean by that is if you have any of those more specific metrics. So if there, are survey reports where they have to meet a certain number of favorable reports, or if a certain amount of reports or deadlines that they were supposed to meet, that would be something that's much more concrete that you could use to gauge success through those metrics. So as I mentioned, there are some common types of biases that we as supervisors just need to keep in mind as we're going through the performance management process, especially when we are preparing for that final evaluation. So confirmation bias is really giving into that natural tendency to search for or interpret information in a way that confirms our thoughts, our existing thoughts or beliefs. So if you were to believe that one of your direct reports is a stellar employee, then potentially this bias would only allow you to see areas where they are excelling, and you might be a bit blind to the areas where they are potentially making mistakes or they're having more of a negative impact. Recency effect, I had mentioned this earlier, but this is placing too much emphasis on recent behavior rather than evaluating a team member's work over the course of the entire year. So this is something we really do have to keep in mind when we are completing the final evaluation. This is natural for all of us to do, and it takes effort to really kind of go back and think what's happened for the entire 12 months, and we need to weigh them equally. The horns effect is evaluating a team member as a poor performer overall because of one thing they don't do well. So kind of giving that a negative or imbalanced weight when we're looking at all the different attributes or expectations. And then the halo effect would be the exact opposite. So evaluating a team member highly in all areas because of potentially one thing they do well. We see this pretty often in employee relations when an employee is, excelling technically in their performance areas. So in terms of the kind of the day-to-day job duties, but what they're potentially not excelling in is the campus core competencies or those soft behaviors, right? Like communication and interpersonal skills. So keeping in mind that just because an employee might be good at the tasks or duties of the job, that shouldn't kind of overshadow how do they engage, interact, communicate. Those are also really important competencies to consider as well. The affinity bias, showing preference for certain team members because they are because you are similar to them in values or other personality aspects. And then the central tendency, we'll sometimes see this too. This is avoiding differentiation by assessing all team members as average. So we'll see this certainly if certain supervisors or departments kind of come in with all of their direct reports being the exact same score. That could happen, but more likely than not, there is differentiation between performance on the team and the supervisors just having a more difficult time kind of making that differentiation and kind of, utilizing their ability to kind of give different scores. We'll see this a lot. We see this sometimes too when supervisors potentially have not addressed performance issues that they've needed to by giving kind of a higher score than potentially the employee deserves. Okay. So some best practices for prevention of difficult conversations. Really, again, being open and engaging with employees by using empathy. That's a kind of a good entree into a difficult conversation or a conversation that's really meant to help a supervisor understand what may be going on with an employee. Potentially noticing performance issues, but also noticing that there could be something else going on in the employee's personal life, and how do you begin that conversation, not only to address the business needs, but also ensure that the employee is connected to campus resources that they may be needing to utilize. Understand what's motivating your employee. This is really important because we understand what motivates our employees. That will help drive collaboration and performance if we can offer rewards that truly motivate the employee. And so for some, that could be promotion or raises. For others, that could be professional development or succession planning. So it's important to kind of understand what's driving our employees and what their kind of professional goals are, and how can we as supervisors help them achieve that regardless of what it is. The idea that prevention makes intervention easier or unnecessary. So again, this kind of goes back to that idea of providing timely feedback, having those difficult conversations if needed, and then engaging with CIRES HR and employer relations if needed. If we can kind of start working on a case in the earlier stages, hopefully the goal would be to course correct. We wouldn't need to continue kind of working down that path. But if we do need to, it's much easier to do that if we've kind of laid the groundwork throughout the case, rather than kind of in the 11th hour trying to make difficult decisions and likely having a higher liability in that case while doing so. Scheduling a time that's free of distractions to provide that neutral and reflective feedback. Again, we've kind of talked about that. Listening first, acknowledging the employee's perspective, and then setting those clear limits and expectations. I think that's important to understand as well. Sometimes employees just need supervisors to hear their perspective, their thoughts. It doesn't mean that we as supervisors necessarily have to always agree with them, but we do need to give them the space to share. And then we can set those clear limits and expectations. Also just important for supervisors, well, really anyone to understand, but especially supervisors if they're having feedback meetings. If it isn't going well, if you're utilizing all of these tactics and it still isn't, please remember that you always have the discretion to kind of end the conversation early. You do not have to keep going through with it if it's no longer become effective or productive. You can set those limits to say, I can see that this isn't going well. This has become kind of an ineffective meeting. We're going to go ahead and pause here, and we'll reconvene in a day or so to finish this conversation. So you're setting the limits that you don't have to kind of stay in an uncomfortable or unproductive situation just because you feel like you have to get through the conversation. You're setting the limits in terms of what behaviors are acceptable and sort of professional to continue with versus not. But you're also setting that expectation that you will continue with the conversation. It doesn't mean that, just because the conversation isn't going well or there are specific behaviors that are preventing it from being successful, doesn't mean that you won't circle back to it later. Certainly, if that also happens, then we would recommend, referring either party to appropriate campus resources, whether that be FSAP or ombuds, just kind of depending on the situation. And CIRES HR and employee relations can help with that as well. And then always following up, especially if it's a difficult conversation, following up with an emailed synopsis of the conversation for documentation and kind of that shared meaning and understanding. And so that will be very important in terms of setting those expectations in terms of what appropriate conduct is, or if there have been changes or needing to provide feedback in terms of meeting expectations. Not only for kind of moving forward, so there is a clear understanding, but also if you as a supervisor are needing to move down the progressive discipline path, you will have written documentation of the instances where you have tried to provide clarification and feedback. And that will be something that CIRES HR and our office will be asking you for, of when have you addressed this with the employee? When have you set those clear expectations? And despite those expectations, you're still seeing these performance concerns. So there really are kind of three different categories of kind of concern or discipline that we look at and kind of talk through. The first is really performance. And so with that, I'm really meaning, again, sort of those day-to-day duties, what's listed in the PDQ or job description. It's really sort of success based on competency with the job. It's not behavior-based. The second then would be this behavior, conduct, or policy violations. So this could be more of the situation where maybe the performance to the job is excelling, but the individual is wreaking havoc in their wake, right? So kind of destroying interpersonal relationships or really abrasive, aggressive communication, potential policy violation. This would be a separate area that has equal weight to performance issues. And this is really where the campus core competencies and values come into play. And then the third bucket would be leave abuse. And that can be areas of either, tardiness, absenteeism, going into doc status, which means an employee is continuing to call out even though they don't have any leave available to them. There is also kind of a smaller area. It doesn't really fit into leave abuse, but that would be situations where an employee has exhausted all forms of leave but are not able to return to work. We have a kind of a separate process through employee relations called the reasonable employer process, where we engage with the ADA team. And if we kind of see it through to completion, we may need to administratively separate an employee for leave exhaustion. So that doesn't really fall into any of these buckets because we call that administrative discharge. It's really through no fault of the employees. It's just they have exhausted all leave, and likely they've kind of exhausted the FMLA and family process, but are still not able to return to work. So I did want to call that out. We don't consider that leave abuse, but that is another way that employees are potentially separated from the university. And then another that we don't really get into in this training is, of course, layoffs and position elimination, which again is not for cause and doesn't fall into any of these areas either. So why is it important to address performance concerns? So really for transparency, the ability to maintain that rapport and keep that trust with an employee, we really need to be able to have those meetings in the moment. That will help keep the trust. I think one of the main issues that we see in employee relations, if a supervisor has waited too long to address an issue or provide feedback, sometimes we'll see a case escalate from there because it can seem disingenuous to an employee, or kind of what University Council calls is pretext, meaning that an employee would potentially think, that must not be the real reason that you are enacting discipline now, because if it was such an issue, you would have addressed it 6 months ago when it occurred. You must actually be doing this because sort of fill in the blank. And that's what pretext means. So there are, of course, just kind of performance management and supervision best practice reasons why we want to address issues in the moment, but there are also legal reasons. The longer the time that goes between an incident occurring and us addressing it, there is more legal liability to that. We certainly also want to ensure that we're understanding the behavior that we're seeing, we're addressing it, and kind of trying to understand, why is it occurring? Are there potentially FMLA, ADA, or training needs? Is it potentially not so much a performance issue as maybe an employee needing campus resources that they may not even themselves be aware that they're needing? We certainly see this on the FMLA family side when an employee is needing to take a lot of leave. They may not be aware that the leave team is an available resource to them. Certainly that balance of empathy for the employee and ensuring that the business needs of the unit are met. I'd say this is one of the hardest pieces of being a supervisor, being able to provide that feedback, showing that empathy, providing resources that employees might need, but also ensuring that we as supervisors are kind of those stewards of meeting the business needs. And so that balance can be hard. And certainly CIRES HR and employee relations can help with that. And then certainly it's also important to address performance concerns when there is poor behavior or poor performance that can negatively affect everyone in the workplace, as well as the trust, reputation, credibility, and ultimately the success of the unit. So that's another kind of reason why we need to address this more in the moment. Is the longer it goes on, not only is it affecting the supervisor and probably the direct report, but also kind of the secondary impact that it's having on the rest of the team and potentially the reputation of the unit. And then certainly poor performance and poor conduct prevents the accomplishments of the goals and mission of the unit. So the different types of employee discipline that we have across campus, there is that informal type coaching that we've been talking about quite a bit, and that follow-up iterative email to, again, make sure that there's clarity of understanding, but also to ensure that we have documentation of that discussion and those clear expectations being set. We have performance improvement plans. We don't see those quite as often, but we do use them. They are a bit more detailed than the supervisor planning section of the ASA. And by that, we mean there's more deadlines, there's more specific metrics, there's more check-ins. And then we really recommend that there's, after that 45, 60-day mark, there's a check back in on the progress. So there's kind of more of those formal type check-ins. But that is a tool that we use, especially if a supervisor believes that it really is just corrective measures that the employee needs to take to be successful. And they'd rather pursue that option first than kind of going down a more formal disciplinary path. So I would say it's kind of in between those informal coachings and emails, then potentially a PIP, then moving more into formal discipline of letter of expectation, letter of reprimand. So the letter of expectation and letter of reprimand are somewhat synonymous. They work the same way. They both go into an employee's personnel file, and they are both considered formal discipline. The difference between them, supervisors have the discretion. They could issue a letter of expectation, give a reasonable amount of time for an employee to improve their performance or conduct. If they're not seeing it, they could then move on to a letter of reprimand if they so chose. I'd say the biggest difference between these is the tone. A letter of expectation is a little bit closer to that performance improvement plan. It's really more formalizing expectations, and that there is a strong hope for improvement and correction. A letter of reprimand is closer to the separation side because the tone of that letter is saying we have set expectations multiple times. At this point, we are sort of formally reprimanding you for something that you very clearly have been communicated to as an issue, and we're not seeing that improvement. So again, the supervisor, in conjunction with CIRES HR and employee relations, can make that determination of which letter is appropriate. But in terms of kind of compliance, they work in the same way, and they will both go into the personnel file. And then, of course, we get to a potential separation if needed. And we, of course, will work with CIRES HR, employee relations, and legal counsel for any type of separation across campus. Okay, so this is somewhat kind of describing the same kind of areas that I've been talking about, except what we're really trying to show with this graphic is there isn't kind of a linear path for employee discipline. It really kind of depends on the nature and severity of concerns, as well as the frequency of the performance concerns. So, kind of starting at this level of the graph, if the severity is low, but the frequency is high, that's how we potentially get to a letter of reprimand. And so it would take kind of more steps. It's the frequency would be continuing, even though the severity is low. So, that could be kind of slight errors on reports or misspellings in emails or things like that. Versus you could have a low frequency, but a very, very high severity of concern. So theft, embezzlement, violence, that would get to separation much more quickly. So, we think of discipline on a continuum in this way. It's, again, not a linear path of A, B, C. It really depends on a lot of variables, and every case is different. So that's why we always encourage you to work with CIRES HR and employee relations, because we have to consider all of these factors when we're looking at an employee case. We also have to look at, has the employee been on any type of job protected leave, like FMLA or family? Do they have any ADA accommodations? Are there any ongoing cases with OIC? Those are all factors that we need to consider when we're talking about discipline and potential separation. So again, when we're having these difficult conversations, when we are either, having the ASA final meeting, or when we're kind of giving that type of feedback that may lead to a letter of reprimand, We always want to listen to what the employees have to say. We have to give them kind of that due process to share their perspective and present any mitigating information. And certainly kind of paraphrasing back what you heard to ensure that you understand what they're trying to communicate. Asking for those specific open-ended questions. So again, we kind of talked about this. Tell me more. How did you reach that conclusion? Help me understand. Citing the specific examples of the behavior. Asking the employee again how they suggest resolving the problem or what solutions they would like to see. Part of this too is the employee taking any accountability or responsibility for the issue or performance problem. That's another important component to consider. Identifying and agreeing on the next steps that you'll each take at the end of the discussion and following up with an email, again, as we kind of talked about. And then referring to FSAP if the employer remains kind of upset through that final evaluation meeting. And then asking the employee to engage with CIRES HR regarding training resources and crucial conversations. So things to consider when you are documenting performance and behavior, and this is true whether you're, kind of at the point of that final evaluation meeting or, throughout the cycle year. And also things that we would be asking between employee relations, CIRES HR, and legal counsel if we are looking to some type of potential separation. Were these issues addressed in a timely manner? When did the events occur, including the dates and times? So that would be information we'd be asking from the supervisor. Were there others present that may have observed this incident? Did the supervisor kind of do that credibility assessment or conversations with others that were present to kind of hear their perspective? And then what were the specific performance concerns that need to be addressed? So again, thinking about those categories, leave, performance, or conduct. Using that specific and fact-based judgment. So removing the emotional kind of judgmental statements and really just focusing on the specific observable behavior. What was the expectation? What was observed? What was the impact? And then potential expectations or remedy moving forward. Were there any extenuating circumstances? I think that's always an important question to ask and consider and may help lead the supervisor to potentially pursuing a different path. We still may move down the disciplinary path if needed, but we also might need to refer the employee to some of those campus resources that exist on campus. And then keeping that list again of documentation for each employee, including that positive and constructive feedback, and using that documentation when you are completing those performance evaluations. We've talked about this a bit, but kind of the documentation again would come from those one-on-one meetings as well. This documentation that you would need for either the final ASA or potential disciplinary processes. So holding those one-on-ones, as we've talked about, with all of your direct reports on a regular basis. Schedule those meetings on your calendar in a mutually conducive time, private location. And remembering to communicate with employees if you cannot attend the one-on-one meetings, really just remembering to reschedule those and considering that one-on-one is almost like sacred time and not rescheduling them often. I think the impact and perception that can create for an employee is potentially that they're not important or that time with them isn't necessary for the supervisor, which is likely not true. There's probably updates and information that do need to be discussed. And again, it can have a large impact on the rapport and relationship if those aren't considered, again, kind of sacred, that they need to be honored in that way. Also documenting our one-on-one meetings. So the agenda, again, who's creating the agenda? Ideally, both individuals would be coming prepared with action items to talk about on that agenda. Having kind of a high-level overview of the conversation, just a synopsis of what was talked about, bullet pointing action items to be discussed for that next meeting or to be followed up on. And then certainly if performance is suffering, having the employee document the meetings and kind of then sending that follow-up email. So some informal steps for addressing performance issues. The supervisor would want to inform their upline of these issues and CIRES HR about the problem early on. Providing that coaching. So again, having these informal meetings that we've been talking about the poor performance and behavior, documenting those meetings, whether it's the follow-up email or just notes for your, kind of for your own records. And then giving the employee tools to improve. So do they potentially need retraining? Does documentation of workflow processes need to occur? Would increased one-on-one meetings or shadowing help? And then is there a mentor or kind of coach for the employee that could help? So factors for consideration, again, when we do move kind of past that informal step and we're considering more formal discipline, we're looking at the nature, extent, and seriousness, as well as the effect or impact of the issue. We're looking at the type and frequency of the issue and how has it been addressed previously or documented. What is that prior feedback, coaching, and corrective actions the supervisor has already made? What is the period of time since the last issue or kind of offense? We'll look at that on the more formal side as well. If it's been 10 years since an employee has received a letter of expectation, we're not going to be at that point of moving towards termination. We will sort of be restarting. Information provided by the employee and others or mitigating circumstances. Again, so that's why it is important to have these meetings with the employee to understand their perspective. Even if it is a serious performance issue, you need to kind of do that due diligence and kind of good faith effort of understanding or at least gathering their perspective, as well as talking to others if there were witnesses regarding the impact that it had. And then, of course, we'll be talking in those meetings with legal about the risk factors and compliance. So as I said, FMLA, ADA, optics, that's another one that we kind of consider sometimes too, is what would the sort of outside perspective or optics of a particular employment action look like, and what would be the impact on the department, and is that something that they're willing to absorb? So again, before you call CIRES HR, these are some things that you should have considered for each of the following for that employee in question. And these will be, things that we'll be talking about in that meeting with CIRES HR as well as employee relations. So what are the job duties of the employee? What are the goals? So the differences between those two could be, we really define job duty as more as what are the day-to-day action items they need to complete, what's listed in the PDQ, whereas goals can be more kind of stretch goals or project-based that may not be the same from year to year. And then competencies, again, are those campus core competencies that really reflect the values and key behaviors for campus. What training has been provided? What is that direct observation? And what are the behaviors? Has there been any informal coaching and feedback, and that as well as any informal documentation? So personal notes, email, follow-up. If you do think that you're at the point of engaging with CIRES HR and especially employee relations, it's really helpful for our process if you can come prepared with as much of this as possible, as well as past ASA scores. Those will all be questions that we'll be asking that will kind of go into the process as well. So I know I've kind of touched on this as well, but FMLA and family do kind of intersect with performance management, and we need to be aware of that as well. So again, FMLA stands for Family Medical Leave Act, and family, which is again new this year, is the Family and Medical Leave Insurance program that we have for all of our employees. Both provide job protected leave. It's important to kind of be aware. There are slight differences between them. Family does also provide partial wage replacement. So I think for the purposes of this training, just know that if your employee does potentially need leave, please just refer them to the system leave team, and they can help them kind of decide which of these programs they're eligible for. For our purposes, just know both of these leave programs offer job protection. And so, there are some compliance pieces that we need to be aware of as we're moving through the process of performance management or progressive discipline, especially if an employee has been designated for FMLA or family. The biggest piece is that we have to remember we cannot penalize an employee for the time that they were out on medical leave. So that may mean that we potentially need to adjust the expectations that were in the plan. We cannot hold them accountable to expectations that would no longer be relevant or attainable based on the time that they were out on leave. We certainly also do not want to reference any medical condition in the employee's review, and only want to evaluate solely on the actual time worked. So to be able to kind of meet those business needs that I know we need to as supervisors as well, considering those interim or temporary reassignment of duties, if the employee is out for extended kind of block periods, of how can we ensure that the employee is able to take the leave that they are legally allowed to take, as well as how are we meeting those business needs. So that can look like, again, hiring temps, reassigning duties while the employee is on FMLA, and our team can certainly help with what that would look like, as well as consulting with the ADA coordinator. Sometimes when employees return from leave, they do have potential restrictions or potential need for reasonable accommodations. And so the ADA office can help supervisors work through that process as well. Okay, so these are just a couple new slides for this year that I added. As an aside from my work in employee relations, I am also the chair of the campus behavioral intervention team. And I had mentioned in the beginning, that is our threat assessment team on campus. And so we're really trying to just kind of get more awareness across campus of what this BIT team is. And we likely see a lot of these reports come in from supervisors when potentially poor performance or poor conduct can escalate into concerning conduct. And so we're just wanting to ensure that supervisors across campus understand this resource and team as well. So again, BIT stands for our behavioral intervention team. And really sort of that mission is that CU is committed to providing that safe environment for faculty, staff, students, and visitors, one that's free of violent behavior and threats of harm. So such behavior is prohibited, of course, in the workplace, as well as by both law and university policy. So we have this behavioral intervention team, which is a multidisciplinary team consisting of representatives from employee relations, OIEC, Campus University Council, so that's our legal counsel, FSAP, CU Police Department, OVA, CAPS, and ADA. So again, it's this multidisciplinary team that will come together and we'll share information regarding potential incidents that give rise to a perceived threat to either self or others. And we'll kind of formulate that appropriate response. So again, there's a lot of information and you'll be sent these slides, but again, just keeping in mind that this team depends on referrals and reviews from faculty, staff, and campus community members that have raised concern. There might be a risk of an individual harming themselves or others, or pose a significant disruption to campus. Please do keep in mind, BIT is not an emergency response. So if you think that there is imminent harm, of course, please still call 911. This team is really dedicated to those cases where there might be concerning behavior and individuals don't know what to do with it or don't quite know where to report it. And oftentimes then we'll see, unfortunately, there's just kind of confusion around what to do, and so nothing is done. So just really wanting campus to understand that there is this team dedicated to looking into these more escalated kind of conduct cases. And that can either be staff, faculty, students, or what we call as non-affiliates. So maybe just members of the community that are maybe sending bizarre emails, or there's kind of bizarre conduct. They're coming into the office and asking bizarre questions, but they're not necessarily doing anything, wrong, but it's kind of raising alarm bells. This would be the team to contact. So I just wanted to include this slide. This is all of the areas where employees can potentially report strange behavior, especially if there is a potential threat to self or others. So we should all be aware that there is a red folder on campus. It should actually be uploaded onto everyone's desktop. And if not, CIRES OIT can certainly help with that. But that is a great resource of information of what type of behaviors do we even want to report? What do we do about them? And what are resources that could help? Safe to tell, of course, is something that our students are very familiar with. That is a reporting mechanism that they've learned from K through 12, but this also exists on campus. So again, just for awareness, wanting to share that these resources are also out there. We also have our Don't Ignore It page, which is a page that OIC kind of hosts. But again, it's a really good resource for just different types of resources on campus that can help with potential concerning behavior. We also have this concerning incident referral form. I've included the link in the slide. It's also linked on that Don't Ignore It page, but this is really where you would go and kind of fill out an anonymous form if there is, again, that concerning incident, not quite sure what to do with it. This would be a good place to report it. We also have a similar team for student concerns, and it's okay if you don't know, where exactly to report it. Our teams work very closely together, and we'll get the right information to each other. But the student of concern team is, again, that threat assessment team on the student side. And then I just included this resource slide again, just for everyone to be aware of. These are other resources. Some are campus resources, some are not. Just to be aware of as supervisors, and we in employee relations can also certainly help refer employees or faculty or staff or students to these offices, but just again to kind of promote awareness across campus of all of the different types of resources that we actually do have on campus and are lucky to have. And these kind of describe the differences that they have. And then I believe that was the last slide. So I know we have a bit of time left, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Again, I know, oh yes, I'm sorry, does it fall under mandatory reporting? No, it does not. It doesn't have the same obligation as OIC. This is more just for, again, those situations that seem concerning, but you're just not quite sure what to do with, right? Maybe it doesn't rise to the level of calling CUPD, but you're not sure what to do with it, right? And so this would be kind of those resources. So to say, I was walking across campus and I saw this just bizarre interaction, or I saw this individual that just seemed off, or, exhibiting behavior that was concerning. But again, not quite sure what to do with it. This is, again, just an awareness that there is a team on campus that can help with these types of situations. We also engage, again, like I said, a lot of the time, some of this does come from performance cases where there is a mix of performance issues, but also kind of personal issues going on that may then lead to conduct that kind of rises to that level of being concerning. In cases, we'll get to our team that way as well. So you can kind of think of it as employee relations cases, but just escalated because the level of behavior communication that we're seeing is lending to a potential threat to self or others. Are there any other questions I can answer either on performance management, any of the protected leave, or the BIT process as well?
I actually
Oh yeah,
do have a quick question here.
yeah,
So for the protected leave, the family program,
yes.
my counterpart who supervises in our group said that that's a Colorado specific program. We have a handful of people, including myself, that are 100% remote.
Yeah.
So how does that apply to fully remote employees that are not in the state?
I was going to say that. So the remote piece doesn't matter. It's the where your permanent residence is, and what you have in the employee portal as your sort of permanent residence. That will depend. That will kind of help the leave team determine whether you're eligible for family or not.
So if you are out of state, you are not eligible?
You are not eligible. No.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Any other questions? Okay, well, I know we're ending a bit early, but certainly, Jimena, if you all get any questions after the training, I'm happy to follow up. Please just let me know.
Thank you, Kelly. Any last minute questions, please feel free to unmute. And if you look up, Lucia just put a Qualtrics link that would take you to a survey. It would take you 1 or 2 minutes to complete. If you could give us some feedback about this and other training interests that you have, that would be fantastic. Okay, well, thank you, everybody, for participating. And remember, the recording will be made available within the next couple of days in Inside CIRES. If you don't know where that is, please email me or Lucia, and we will help you out.